Hello and welcome to the fourth out of 5 webinars in our series focusing on racial inequality in maternal health care. For those who are new to joining us today, my name is Hannah Travis and I am an Associate Solicitor in the Women's Health Team at Bulk Kemp. A very warm welcome for you to taking the time to attend today. We know how valuable your time is and we very much appreciate you joining us today, so thank you. I am very delighted to welcome today's speaker, Mars Lord. Mars is a coach and birth activist. She is a multi-award winning doula, the most recent award being given for the Channel 4 Dispatches Maternity Scandal programme, which many of you may have seen. She is also a mentor, educator, and sits on the RCOG Race Equality Taskforce and on the panel for the Birthrights Legal inquiry into Black Maternal Health. Mars is in extremely high demand, both in the UK and all across the world, as a speaker and trainer. Mars created a Boiler Doulas, a doula preparation course, primarily but not exclusively for the Black and brown-bodied people. She is also the founder of Black Lives a Boiler Scholarship. This scholarship is to help Black women who wish to become doulas to train and not to be held back by socio-economic disadvantage. She's also an inclusion consultant, several large companies, causing them to look deep into their practice to make systemic and structural change. So we are very grateful to Mars for taking the time to join us today in this series and excited to hear us speak to us today. In today's webinar, Mars will be breaking down what she sees as the relevant updates to Embrace and see if we can all discover practical ways to close the gap. So just a bit of housekeeping. After the talk, there will be a Q&A session at the end. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and we'll come to those all at the end. These webinars will also be recorded and a copy of the recording will be sent out to all those attendees who couldn't make today's session because we all got busy lives, and it will also be put on our website. So that's enough from me now, and I am very pleased to now hand over to Mars Lord to kick us off. So thank you, Mars.
Thank you for having me. So let's jump straight in. I'm going to share my screen with you all and let's go. So today we're going to be talking about racial inequality in Black maternal health. And for you, those of you that are confused, we're going to be looking at how we close the gap. So my name is Mars Lord, and you've heard a little bit about me, or a lot of bit about me. In the words of my mother, I have a lot of knowledge and I like to share it. So I find myself as a birth keeper, as a doula educator, as a life coach and a birth activist. I find myself talking a lot about the things that affect me as a Black-bodied woman. And having 5 children, birth obviously is something that truly affected me and my life. And we know you've had the wonderful Dr. Christina Ketche speak before, and she talks a lot about the life arc, the work that we do together at the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists as part of the Race Equality Taskforce. Is we talk about the life arc of Black and brown-bodied women, how we're going to improve maternal health. And so my different roles allow me to be in this arena in different ways. As a trustee at birthrights.org.uk, as a panelist for the legal inquiry into Black maternal death, which the findings should all be coming in soon. And I think by the end of this year, I always get confused with the dates, you'll start to see the dissemination of the results from that. I'm part of RCOG's Race Equality Taskforce, as I said. I'm also the interim chair of the Inequality Midwifery Trust currently, that gives awards for education to midwives. I'm a birth activist and think of myself as a reproductive justice warrior, because what happens in the world of birth in the perinatal period when you're Black or brown-bodied isn't as fabulous as it could be, or perhaps should be. On the personal note, as I mentioned, I'm the mother of 5 and nonna to 2, and this is important to me because this affects the life of my children and their children going forward. Audre Lorde is one of my favorite writers. And when they write, they've said, caring for myself is not self-indulgent, it's self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. For Black and brown-bodied people, the thought that they might care for themselves, be still, be human beings rather than human doings, can be an anathema for many. We're taught through societal, familial, personal narrative that our role is to be constantly moving, constantly working, constantly doing. There's the assumption that we will always care for and raise up other people to our own detriment. And so in doing this work, I hope to show that when Black and brown-bodied people thrive, everyone thrives, because caring for ourselves is not self-indulgent, it's self-preservation. And that's our act of political warfare. When we think about closing the gap, there's the perceived problem, what's being said, what's being repeated. Again, the narrative, the medical narrative, what's coming through the curricula, what the doctors and midwives and health clinicians are saying, what some of the research points to, or in many ways, what a lot of the research seems to point to. Then we have the actual problem, what birthing people themselves say. And I know that the wonderful Elsie Gale broke down the maternal journey, shared a deep story so that people could see and hear someone's experience through the system. I recommend that you get the recording to that. And if you have it and haven't yet already, that you do go and have a watch and a listen. And then there's closing the gap, what you can do, you, the individual, the healthcare professional, the doctor, the midwife, the lawyer, the parent, the educator, member of society. What can you do to close the gap? So Embrace release their audit and their confidential inquiry report every year about the 1st of November. A couple of years ago, when we were at the point of general election, there was an embargo on the Embrace report, which seemed weird because the Embrace report isn't something that talks to the political landscape as such. And what we'd been seeing with the Embrace report through the previous years was the increase in the risk to Black and brown-bodied people in the perinatal period and as they birth their children. When the last report came out, and they're released every 3 years, but every year there is a small update. I say small update. Sorry, Professor Knight, if you're listening. I don't like to underplay your work because your work is amazing. But each year they release some information, and I think the next big report is due at the end of this year. But we continue to see an increase in the number of Black and brown-bodied people at risk. And we tend to focus in very highly on the maternal mortality rate and don't spend a lot of time looking at the morbidity rate, the mortality rate, the people that die, the morbidity rate, the people who have those near misses. And about 80% of those near misses belong in Black and brown bodies. And the last report, we had gone from the shocking, in quotation marks, figure of 5 times more likely to 4 times more likely. And for some, it felt like this was an incredible improvement that it had dropped. But actually, when you look closely at the Embrace report lets you know that statistically there's no difference. Other things to note and to consider when thinking about the 4 times more likely, and actually it's 4.35 times more likely, is the reclassification of race. Who's Black, who's brown, who's deemed to be Black, who's deemed to be brown, who fits into that category. It didn't seem to change for mixed heritage people. They were 3 times more likely, and South Asians were twice as likely as their white counterparts. These would be shocking, or we would consider ourselves to be in crises if it wasn't for the fact that these things continue and continue with no real change. And actually the scandal is that nothing is being done to stop this. But we watch the rise of the figures. We know that maternal mortality is rare, or the numbers are low, but that Black-bodied people, brown-bodied people are disproportionately represented there. And so we talk about the perceived problem. These are the things that people tell us are the reason why Black and brown-bodied people continue to not do so well in maternal health. There's a lot of victim blaming in this perceived problem. We talk about the fact that it's the different levels of melanin, and we don't use those words, that cause the problems. It's that African pelvis. It's the predispositions that come in. It's the fact that they're Black and they're brown, and there's nothing we can do about it. They're just high risk. Let's decide on an intervention that we can just give to people when we look at the color of their skin. But these predispositions that they have, the tendency towards diabetes, cardiac, respiratory issues, etc., those are the reasons that we blame. But we don't look at the white-bodied women and birthing people who suffer from the same conditions in the same way, as though somehow this was just the purview of the darker skin. The higher the level of melanin, the more likely this is to happen. And so we're at risk because we're too Black. Another argument is that we're too poor. The socioeconomics are at play. We are more likely to be at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. And because we're more likely to be at the socioeconomic scale, we're not likely to be buying the healthy foods and buying the classes and things that we need to buy to become good birth givers, which is very strange because this whole phenomena of going to yoga classes and Pilates, etc., all of which are wonderful and lovely, are actually relatively new to the birthing process. So we look at the socioeconomics and we say, well, because they're poor, this is why they're dying. This is why they're not doing so well. They're more likely to be at high risk. But what we do know is that that's not strictly true. We're too stupid. We don't access the education. We're less likely to go to antenatal classes. We're less likely to go to baby groups, national antenatal courses, etc. And well, we're ethnic minority. We don't quite know how to behave in the same way as our host nation continent. And when I think about those 4 things, when it comes to being too Black and being prone to predispositions, things that we might want to consider, things that we might want to think about is, as Dr. Christina Ketchy mentioned, the life arc, the continual daily microaggressions that cause us to have higher than normal, higher than average cortisol levels, because we live in stress-filled bodies that we're so used to living in that we no longer recognize it as an issue. You only need to hear the news. We have on the news today, or last night and all of today, about the young Black girl, and she was a girl, not a young Black woman, she's a young Black girl who was forced to be strip searched with no appropriate or safe adult with her because a teacher smelt cannabis and decided that this young Black girl with a head full of locks was clearly dealing drugs. As a parent, this is what, a Black parent, this is what we send our children into every day, a world that suspects them because of the levels of melanin. If you live with continual microaggressions, racial microaggressions, then of course your body is going to bear the weight of the stress of that. So diabetes, respiratory issues, cardiac issues are all at play. We know that Black middle-class women are still at greater risk than poor working-class white women. And when we talk about socioeconomics being to blame, it's quite easy then to not look at the Black body, the brown body, and deal with the unspoken, unconscious bias that's at play there. But it's not about the money, and it's not about the color of the skin. We know that university-educated Black women still do worse than their white counterparts. So it's not about education, because actually there are Black and brown-bodied people within antenatal classes, etc. But that's where they have the time to attend those classes. But most of those classes, the other people, the imagery, the language doesn't reflect us. And when we look at us as a global minority, sometimes people are shocked to discover that actually we are the global majority. And as the global majority, one would suspect that it's not the melanin that causes us to do badly. But if it was so, we would be the global minority. A wonderful book that I recommend to everyone to read at the moment, that's a very painful read, and I'm taking myself through it slowly, is Superior, The Return to Race Science by Angela Sani. And it speaks to what I'm talking about now, that the reason we're dying is because we're Black. And that, my friends, is the study of eugenics. So what is the actual problem? If that's the perceived problem, if the perceived problem is we're too Black, we're too poor, we're too stupid, we have these predispositions that are causing all of these harms. And please don't imagine that when I say that, I don't think there are predispositions, there are conditions presenting themselves in our highly stressed bodies. And a wonderful doctor friend talked about how her hospital had them all assessed, to do some tests, to look at their sympathetic system, to look at the levels of cortisol in their bodies. And she considers herself very happy-go-lucky, always laughing and smiling. And the hospital called her back in because her levels were dangerously high. Let me just make sure that everyone is able to hear me. Oh, yes, good. So I was just having a look at the chat box in case there was something I needed to take note of, but there is nothing. So the actual problem. So we know the perceived problem, that Black bodies are just a bit crap at giving birth. Well, oops, I went too far there. No, perceived problem, actual problem. Okay, forgive me. No one is listening. Just before, I think it was just before the pandemic, a young Black influencer went to the hospital. This was in the August, I think. And in the June, the Royal College of Midwives had sent down some guidance that if Black-bodied women appear with respiratory issues or complaining of respiratory issues, to take them seriously and to investigate further. So this young Black woman who had a popular YouTube channel, and in one of her last YouTube appearances said that she felt the baby was trying to kill her from inside out. That's how she was describing how she was feeling. She went to the hospital and was told by the midwife that breathlessness is normal and she should go away. She should go home. Later that night, she had a heart attack and both her and her unborn 8-month-old died. No one is listening. You will have heard that through Elsie's talk. No one is listening. You'll hear people say, we must teach Black and brown-bodied women how to speak up. No one is listening because that pushes the problem back out and off and away from the Black and brown-bodied, and means that perhaps the issues aren't their fault. They're sharing their fears. They are sharing their symptoms, their concerns, their mental health worries. And no one is listening. One of Time's Women of the Year this year, 2022, is the incredible midwife, Jenny Joseph. This is where we all get to do, those of us this side of the pond, a huge pat on the back, because Jenny Joseph is an NHS trained midwife who went to America some decades ago and began to work as a midwife. She jumped through all of the hoops. She thought it'd be quite easy. She jumped through all of the hoops. She did all of the work. She became a midwife down in Florida. And she now runs the first ever Black certified midwifery school. And Jenny Joseph has the JJ way. And the JJ way is based quite simply on listening. Her maternal mortality, morbidity rates are negligible because it doesn't matter what shade, what shape you are. When you walk into her clinic, you are listened to. And so we have the activists, the people like me. I bought this T-shirt for every Black mother that is 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications, for every Black baby that's 230% more likely to die before their first birthday, for every Black birth worker that's fighting to change all of the above, and thus the course of Black history. And within months of buying this T-shirt from Sister Midwife in the States, our numbers had changed and we'd become 5 times more likely to die. We know the problem. We know that people aren't being listened to. So we're raising our voices to see if anyone will hear, to see who'll join the conversation, to see who will help us as we work to close the gap. And as we work to close the gap, this doesn't mean that we want more research, because we have the research. We have shelves upon shelves upon shelves of research. But all of the research looks to see why the Black or brown body doesn't work as efficiently as the white body. Remember the return to race science? We don't look outside of that body to see what happens as someone steps in to the maternity care system. Does this mean that we think that it's only within the maternal system, the maternity system? No. Remember, this is a life arc. These are continual racial microaggressions. This is the biological weathering of a body long before it appears, before someone to say, hey, I'm pregnant. For those that don't know what weathering is, biological weathering, it's a term coined by Professor Arlene Geronimus in the States. And weathering is simple to understand. If we look at a cliff and we see the way the waves hit that cliff, strong waves, small waves, clumps of earth come down, holes are created, there's erosion. Biological weathering is the continual microaggressions, the societal narrative, bashing against that black-bodied soul, going into their very being, the cortisol levels, the predispositions before they place themselves into the hands of the maternity system. And we are so blessed to have midwives and a maternity system. But do not assume that because we have that, anti-Blackness doesn't exist there. So the response to a lot of this is a lot of screaming and defensiveness. It can't be true. It can't be true. For we are altruistic people. We have come into this profession to do good. Well, the vast majority have. The hugely vast majority have come into maternal health to do good. But we don't shrug off societal narrative just because we put on a uniform to support birth. We do not get rid of the stories that we hear and we see that are skewed to just remind us that Black and brown-bodied people aren't quite as good as the BAFTAs. Oh my word, I love the theatre. And when a white woman who wins an award uses that opportunity to denigrate 2 Black women in the room, you had it tough, but I had it tougher, she says. The response is defensiveness. The response is, no, this can't be, and how dare you call me a? I challenge you, if that response is rising in you, answer the question for yourself. Not, am I calling you, but are you being? Because why would that rise in you, that defensiveness? And then I remember you're altruistic. And when someone is altruistic and you question something they do, they internalize that to mean that you are questioning and attacking their goodness. And no one wants to be or to feel or to perceive themselves attacked for being good. And so this response centers all but the people who are dying. because it's not kind to point out the cruelty of causing harm. What we fail to talk about, whilst we talk about Black maternal death and Black maternal mortality, is we forget to talk about how people thrive. What can we do to ensure that people thrive so that we have our lovely, healthy babies, our lovely, healthy bodies, spirits, emotions, mental health. When we go on a mission, when we send our brain out with the task to discover maternal mortality, then we can grab and bring together all of the examples. A young Black woman who I trained as a doula went on to have her second baby, and her first experience wasn't a great one, where she wasn't listened to. And even at the time of doing my course, she said she was unsure if she should do the course because she wasn't sure that she'd fully debriefed from the birth experience she'd had before. After doing the course, she talked about how informed she felt, how she wanted to advocate for others, how she knew she'd be able to advocate for herself when she had her next child. But she wasn't sure how long it would be. Well, that baby was born 3 months ago. And that baby was born very beautifully, healthily and happily at home with midwives in attendance. And they were thriving. And so she declined the optional health visitor visits. And immediately, this healthy, happy, Black-bodied family were referred to social services. Stepping away from a system that causes us not to thrive can bring consequences of punishment. What happens when we thrive? This should be the thing that motivates us to take the Embrace report and say, okay, I recognize the constellation of biases here, the constellation of issues, the constellations of reasons. What can I do to change that constellation of bias into a useful tool to ensure that the Black and brown-bodied people within my care get to thrive? What would happen if the bar for thriving was no longer the floor? Yes, no longer the floor. Well, at least you've got a healthy baby, has been a common refrain. One that I hear less of, fortunately, and I'm really glad to hear that less and less. But is the floor really what we're aiming for when we care for our Black and brown and white-bodied people? We know that when we look after the least in our society, then everyone thrives. Something that I've noticed is that in the television adverts, since the murder of George Floyd, we have had more Black people in our television adverts. And very quickly after, if not simultaneously, we've had more non-binary representation, disabled, disability representation. Suddenly, by thinking about the Black and brown-bodied, we're able to see the way others are mistreated and marginalized, and we're able to raise them up. What happens when we thrive? The world thrives. Our society thrives. We all thrive. We know that Black women are the most unprotected and most disrespected people in the world. The actual quote from Malcolm X is, "The most disrespected person in America," and for America, I think we can put the West, is the Black woman. The most unprotected person in America is the Black woman. The most neglected person in America is the Black woman. If she's the most unprotected, what happens when we protect her and see her thrive? What if we begin to see Black and brown-bodied women and birthing people simply as ordinary people deserving of the same love as others? I say all the time to people, what we need is simply to love one another. What happens when we see that they just do ordinary things, love on their families, care for their families, support their families, uplift their families? Ordinary people doing ordinary things, not because of the color of their skin, not because of their gender, their ability, but simply ordinary people doing ordinary things, living ordinary lives. When we see people like that, when we see people as people, then it's easy to love them. It's easy to interrogate the reports that come out that say racism isn't an issue in this country, that bias has no part in our health service with people, that this strand of society is better than that strand, that the biases that affect us all don't walk into work with us. When we see that the maternal mortality rate appears to have dropped from 5 to 4.35 times more likely, let's ask ourselves why. Because these reports, this research is done several years in advance. It's not done on the year of. So it wasn't because we'd hit 5 times more likely and people were up in arms, because those changes hadn't come yet. Wonderful activists like Elsie Gale, who's been working in this since way before birth was even a thought in my mind, has constantly called into question the way people are treated, the way people aren't listened to, the way people are ignored. What are you watching? What are you reading? What are you seeing? What is it that reinforces the narrative that these are not just ordinary people doing ordinary things? We're going to come to a point in a minute where I'm going to start to answer some questions. And I really do encourage you to pop your questions into the chat box or into the Q&A box so that I can start to talk to them. And I'm really happy for you to ask me pretty much anything, including what's my favorite wine. And you'll find that it's Malbec, and I particularly like the black Malbec because it just tastes so good, and a steak dinner. But feel free to ask me anything about this presentation. But if those are the personal details you want, there you go, you have them already. But so now I want to ask you, what is it that you are going to do to close the gap? Bob Burden Kemp have put on a series of Black maternal health webinars. Well, what an excellent starting point to get to see what's going on, what people's thoughts are, how they think this all plays out in front of us. So what are you going to do in your personal life, your work life, your life in society to close the gap? How are you going to educate yourself? How are you going to ensure that you listen to the people in your care? How are you going to believe them? So let's look at some of the questions that you have, and then I'll continue with some thoughts of my own as to things that you can do.
Mars, are you happy to read from the Q&A? If not, I've got them listed here if you would like me to read them out for you.
No, I'm all right just now, my love. I'm all right just now. I'm going to start with the chat box, what's in there. And then if you can read the Q&As to me, then that would be wonderful. So some comments that we've got in the chat box. The classes I was in, I was the only Black woman, and I did loads of classes, paid, free, face-to-face. And I wonder if it's because we just aren't represented. It frustrated me how the topics they spoke about just didn't include me. When we look at the literature, at the imagery, at the leaflets and things that we're given, we often see that the images are of a white-bodied woman with her white-bodied child. And as people decided to, or recognize, sorry, that they should become more inclusive in the imagery, then the next worrying trend was that those images of Black and brown-bodied people went next to the problems. I remember getting in touch with the La Leche League because they had started to use brown-bodied imagery, and it was a Black mother, grandmother, and child, very happy looking family, and to all intents and purposes, according to the image, a close family. And they illustrated the section, what happens when you don't have family support. The words and the images don't always match up, but the narrative that's perpetuated is the narrative of a group of people, a community of people that don't know how to hold families together. Katie says, BAFTA's speech, shocking that was, not representative of intersectional feminism. So much to think about. Not enough representation in health photography, literature of Black and brown bodies, and the hard to reach argument is so wrong. The importance of Black and brown imagery in health cannot be understated enough. Because, oh, sorry, overstated enough. Because I remember hearing people talking about breastfeeding and thrush. And the way that you diagnose thrush is you ask the parent, can you see a red rash on your skin? And I remember asking some internationally board certified lactation consultants, so the highest of the high in the breastfeeding world. What happens when your skin is too dark to see? Oh, they said. What else have you got? Well, a very common answer. A question that hadn't been considered. Now, I forget the name of the actress who said it, but I remember it really struck a chord with me. And I'll kick myself because immediately I finish, I'll remember her name. And she was talking about the underrepresentation of women over 40 in film and on stage, etc. And she said the line, "They don't miss us when they don't see us." Because the representation of birth and the perinatal period was so covered in white imagery, no one missed the fact that there were issues within the Black and brown bodied community because they couldn't see anything. They didn't see it. It didn't affect them. I was speaking on Monday to some counselors and psychotherapists. And one guy said in his question, "I realize how little I know." And I said, "Why would you know if it doesn't affect you?" Hard to reach. That's an argument that we hear all the time. That's a defense response. They're a hard to reach community. A lovely young midwife at a conference about 2 years ago put up her slide talking about underserved communities. And someone commented in the chat and said, "Oh, you need to be careful when you write that word because it reads undeserved." Of course, I had to respond to that. And I said, why, it's absolutely correct, because they're not seen as deserving the same level of attention and care as that well-educated, white-bodied woman that comes into the hospital. Hard to reach. Why are they hard to reach? What time are your classes? If we want to tie into the socioeconomic argument, then perhaps the timing of those classes mean that they can't go to work or they can't get childcare. Or perhaps they are a sole provider for their family. Is it that they're hard to reach because we decide to stay within our offices and our walls and not go out to them? Is there anything to do to support this woman that I mentioned? Drop me a line in my Instagram at Abuela Doula, ABUELA, and I'll let you know if she started anything. I know that she's asking people to share her post, and she was talking to her MP. But it's very difficult when you're a black-bodied person and you get referred to the social services. It's very hard to become untangled from that. How do I feel about the language used in the NHS and government documents, e.g. disparities? Is this a form of whitewashing the issues? If you control F, okay, now you're talking to my lack of tech here. If you control F on a document, and I'm so going to try that now because I've never seen that written down before, you won't see black or brown, you just see ethnic minority. Do you know, one of the reasons why I hate, Mars, hate is a strong word, hate, BAME, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, is that I have watched, witnessed and heard people get down funding simply for, I should give you my face, you know, get down funding for themselves for under the minority ethnic part of the acronym, completely forgetting the Black. And I called a couple of people out on it and they said, yes, but the funding is for BAME. Did you know when it comes to the research, that reminds me, very little funding, very little money goes, oh, in fact, none. I think with COVID, 3 billion, not a single penny went to a Black or brown-bodied researcher. So what do we think about the language used in NHS government documents, disparities? Is it a form of whitewashing? I think it's a way to just distance ourselves a little from what's going on so that we don't quite say the thing that is happening. And again, I think if we were to change ethnic minority to global majority, there would be a lot of difference in the way these things are done. Georgina says, listen, that one of the things that they're going to do is listen more to people's experiences and come to seminars like this to listen and understand about unconscious bias and people's experiences. So Georgina and others that are doing this, I always emphasize this one point. Don't go and find your Black friend or your Black colleague and ask them to tell you, ask them to educate you on what's going on. This is where Google is your friend. I always tell people, I would always say to my clients, Dr. Google is not your friend. And I still believe that Dr. Google is not your friend. But there is so much information, so many stories and tales out there that you can read and you can listen to. But your next step is to say, okay, how do I not make this about me? And this isn't to you personally, Georgina, this is to everyone that has that thought. How do you not clutch your chest and your pearls in defensiveness or in outrage or in horror and talk about how much you are upset by these things rather than talking about this happened to you? How can I help? I spoke at a breastfeeding conference to a group, and again, pre-COVID, because everything then went online. And I talked about the fact that we really do not have time for white fragility, white tears, white saviorism, white centering, and white defensiveness, etc. And as I began to talk about the maternal mortality rates, a woman began to cry. And so I got her to breathe with me, and we took a minute or two to steady her breathing, to regulate herself. And then I said, whilst I've been comforting you, whilst the room has been worried for you, everyone's forgotten that Black and brown-bodied people are dying because you are unable to sit in the discomfort of hearing the tales without being upset and making it about you. So I applaud that you're going to listen to more people's experiences, Georgina, because I think that's an important thing to do. But remember my caveat, keep them centered. Aisha says, what methods would you use to enable positive change regarding the attitudes towards Black women and being listened to during childbirth? Knowledge, confidence, a doula. Okay, Aisha, we all know that I'm completely biased here. Of course, I'm going to say a doula. However, I have a caveat with doulas as well. Are the educators, the doulas, the healthcare practitioners, the doctors, Are they culturally safe? Are they culturally humble? Is it hashtag all women when they work? Or is it, I recognize what goes on with you? I think doulas were trained, well, until I started training, we're trained not to advocate for people. Black and brown bodied people need advocacy because often they aren't listened to. When I was part of the Black maternity scandal, the Dispatches program on Channel 4, I shared the story. In fact, they used it as one of their sound bites, which anyway, I just laugh at these things, but not that issue. Of the Black father, when saying to the midwife, you're not listening to my wife and you're not reading her birth plan, was told that he was being aggressive and they would call security in. Knowledge, we have a lot of knowledge. We mustn't assume that Black and brown bodied people are stupid. I have Asian clients, South Asian clients, who tell me why they dress up in their best clothes to go to hospital appointments because they don't want to be seen as stupid. Is it confidence? In America, in the last few years, some incredibly knowledgeable, confident Black-bodied women who advocate for and agitate for Black maternal health died whilst or just after giving birth to their babies. What methods would I use to enable positive change? I would challenge people to listen. Sunita, as a layperson, what's the best advice that I can give to my fellow women who may be discriminated against in their pregnancy and labour journey? Well, I've always said, get everything written down. If you're, and I say this to whatever colour body you're in, if your doctor or your midwife tells you that you will die, your baby will die, this dreadful thing will happen, get them to write it down and sign it, because your notes or their notes are legal documents. They won't write it down. If you and or your baby are at that risk, trust me, they will move very quickly and do the thing they need to do to attempt to save your lives. The best advice that you can give to women and birthing people who may be discriminated against in their pregnancy and labour journey is to get themselves a birth debrief, to record what happened, to get in touch with the hospital trust under which they gave birth to their baby, whether it's in hospital or whether they birthed at home. Take the names of the people that are caring for you. The vast, vast, vast majority of doctors and midwives are good people. Keely, how can we tackle the issue around colleagues wanting to say, oh, well, we only have a small amount of women from ethnic minority backgrounds? Keely, let me lean into the screen and kiss you. When people say we only have a small amount of women, ask them how many deaths are acceptable. Ask them how many morbidities are acceptable. We only have 3% of ethnic minority background people. Remind them again, they're the global majority within our trust. What's the actual number of that percentage? Is it 3, 30, 300, 3,000, 30,000? Ask them what the number is, and then ask them again, how many lives is it acceptable to lose? How many near misses is it acceptable to have? That's what you do when they ask the question, and that's how you tackle the issue. I find the Avni. I find the generalizations so patronizing, e.g. COVID. There's so much emphasis on people of color refusing to be vaccinated, whereas in my line of work, I know plenty of white healthcare professionals who've opted not to be vaccinated, and yet they're not made an example of. So, of the 8 pregnant women who died during COVID, they were all Black and brown-bodied. We talk about the fact that Black and brown-bodied people are more at risk of COVID, forgetting that they tend to be on the frontline workers, or the people who can't afford to stay home, or who are more likely to be disciplined if they step back and refuse to work and stay home. At the beginning, as the conversations were being raised and the discussions about vaccinations became louder and higher, 2 French doctors, world-renowned doctors, said, we must test this in Africa. Some of you may know of or have heard of the Tuskegee experiment, where they took healthy young Black men and injected them with syphilis, telling them that what they were doing was simply testing them and treating them for bad blood. But they were injecting a live virus into them, then sending them home to their healthy wives and families. And no one was told. The last survivor of the Tuskegee experiment died within the last 10 or 20 years, I think. And once again, the narrative points to the Black or brown body being responsible for the health of a white society and nation. People of color are refusing to be vaccinated. People are celebrating Eid. People are celebrating Eid and Diwali, but it's okay to commemorate the world wars. It's okay to celebrate Christmas. Those Black Lives Matter protests that are going to spread COVID. Yes, the generalizations are patronizing, but the societal narrative can't be shifted or changed. God forbid. And those narratives come into our hospitals as well. We know that Black and brown-bodied midwives are far more likely to be disciplined than white-bodied midwives for much lesser offences. And yet when you go to the end of the extreme, you see that white-bodied midwives are more likely to be struck off. So clearly their issues are more serious. Aisha says that a doctor tried to force her into having a vaccine during pregnancy. And this isn't a discussion about vaccines, but the issue here isn't the vaccine. The issue is a doctor tried to force me to. We saw recently with the National Institute of Clinical Health and Excellence, their draft guidelines to reduce Black maternal mortality was to decide that all Black and brown-bodied women and birthing people should be induced at 39 weeks, regardless of the state of their pregnancy, the health of their pregnancy, and the level of their risk. A quick plaster on a gushing wound. And it was framed under consent. But what is consent if someone declines and social services are called? It's a time sorry. Oh gosh, this is where the end of my glasses clearly aren't clean enough. I apologize for the mispronunciation of your name. Dekwa says, is the term biological weathering referring to racism in particular, or is racism part of it? Dr. Arlene Geronimus coined it to speak to the health of Black-bodied people. So by adding racial to biological weathering, then that gives people no doubt what I'm talking about. But the biological weathering in this instance, as coined by Dr. Arlene Geronimus, is referring to racism microaggressions. Sunita, I'm so lucky a brown woman spotted that I had mastitis early in my breastfeeding journey. It didn't look like the pictures you find on Google. Representation matters. Yes, this question about redness. I watch videos on baby-led weaning and they always say, loud and red, let them go ahead. Silent and blue, they may need you, which is worrying if a child is choking, or when worrying if a child is choking. However, Black and brown babies don't look obviously blue as they're choking, nor do we look the way that white-bodied people look when we are suffering from lack of oxygen, because our skin doesn't change the way white skins change. They change differently. Hutano is an online app, Hutano, that talk about Black health and Black and brown skins. And I think, oh, his name escapes me. There's a wonderful young Black doctor, student doctor, who's written a book. In fact, I think it is Malone, that does lots of imagery and representation. I think you can now begin to Google and find that and implement it in your practice. Avni said, I lost all trust in the NMC, the National Medical Council, since the situation with the influencer who made racist comments about a guest on her podcast who's still able to practice as a midwife 2 years later. I wouldn't take the chance of being in the hands of someone like that. What can you do when it's blatant and it's obvious and no one chooses to listen? Hard to reach, says Georgina, puts the onus on the people being reached out to do something differently, whereas it's often the people wanting to reach out who are not understanding the right way to do that. And also, Georgina, and those that have that question, the people who, when you hear the things that someone like Avni says about losing trust, when you hear about the way social services are called for simple things. I know a young woman who went to the doctor with a concern about her baby and he misdiagnosed her. She got a second opinion and was sent straight into hospital. He had suggested that she go to hospital, to be fair, but she took a second opinion because it didn't make sense to her what he was saying, because he wasn't describing what was going on with her baby. And immediately she was placed under the gaze and the eye of social services. Whereas a white-bodied woman, had she done that, would have been told, you're a first-time mum, these things we need to take notice of. Well done for bringing your child in. She was the only person on that ward who never left her child's side, despite the hospital continually saying, leave him with us and you go off and do. And yet she was the one accused of neglect. What do I think of the regulators of midwives? Oh, Elsie. Hello, Elsie. I hope you were here at the beginning. People seriously re-listen to Elsie's webinar. What do you think about the regulators of midwives? The regulators of midwives and obstetricians could do to repair the disparities and close the gap? We know that change has to come from the top down and the bottom up. We spend a lot of time saying that the midwives and the doctors on the ground should change things. They're the ones that can make things happen. But then they meet that wall where nothing goes any further. So it has to happen from the top down. I think the work that RCOG, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, are doing with the Race Equality Taskforce is a lot deeper than a lot of people recognise. They're really starting to ask what they can do here. I think the regulators can start to believe the Black and brown bodied midwives, the Black and brown bodied service users who are bringing forward their complaints. And instead of thinking, we're just lovely people here, our midwives don't behave like that, or instead of just moving those people to another hospital where they, and another trust where they can cause harm to another group of people, I think they need to start to take notice. I think they need to interrogate why they have a disproportionately high ratio of Black and brown bodied healthcare professionals flagged up as risks or on suspension. And they need to interrogate the anti-Blackness at work there. Oh, Anna, it was lovely to have you. This was about 20 minutes ago. You posted your message. So I just thought I'd say you're welcome. Keely. Oh, I've got some fans here. Keely and Aisha. Keely, how do we tackle the issues around putting poor white women and Black and brown women in the same sentence when working on healthcare strategies? Poor white women have bad outcomes, but not the same. That's the hashtag white women to hashtag all women. Working on the Race Equality Taskforce, working on the legal panel for Black Maternal Health, right at the very beginning of their work. In both cases, separately, two white women said, what about the traveling community? And another would say, what about the working class, as though somehow being Black meant you were automatically not working class, but pedantics. Call them out. Say, hold on. Each is important, but here we're looking at Black-bodied people. Let's talk about what happens to them. Then in our next meeting, we can talk about poor white women or the traveling community. They're conflated so that people don't have to deal with anti-Blackness. It's as simple as that. Black men being sent home because midwives feel threatened, and they only support Black women may have in the room. This is what I was worried about when I was at the hospital, but I had a positive birth experience and I was listened to. I'm so pleased that you had a positive birth experience and that you were listened to. That comes to the societal narrative. This is why I'm asking, what are you all going to do to change that societal narrative? We know that when a family is divided and the father is no longer in the home, that Black fathers are more involved with their families than white fathers that leave the home. Hazra, I hope I said your name right. Oh, beautiful name. Anyway, thank you for mentioning us South Asians. Wearing a hijab, cultural dress, means you may as well be walking around with stupid on your forehead, no matter how well educated or articulate you are. Well, Hazra, we know that narrative very well. And of course, I would mention South Asians, because it would be remiss of me as part of a marginalized and historically excluded community to erase you the way that I'm being erased. So yes, we stand together. Jaspreet, I work alongside people who ignore emails or talks about race equality. I don't work alongside many disruptors. How can I tackle this? Well, the sad news is, Jaspreet, and again, I hope I have the pronunciation right, is that the people that need these things tend to be the people that don't come to these things. If you have a conference or a talk on how to make your marriage thrive, the people who need it never go to it. So perhaps there are different titles that need to be given. Or perhaps this is something that you flag up with your higher ups, your management, etc., and ask them, how do they include it in the middle of an obligatory something? So I don't know what your work is. Say there is a new legal precedent that needs to be talked about within the company and everybody has to be there. Whack it in the middle of that. And frankly, don't let people turn their videos off in Zoom calls, because they can turn it on and go away. Do nothing. Sunita. Ooh, abs. I'm guessing that abs means absolutely. Whose skin color? Oh, abs. Whose skin color means pulse oximeters give less accurate oxygen readings. And that was something that they discovered in the pandemic. It's like, oh, the machine that we've got that doesn't read through the darkness of skin is giving us false readings, so we don't need to listen to the people that are telling us that they're in trouble. Oh, we're coming towards the end. Is it 6 o'clock or 6:30? Because I saw 6:30 and I'm at
plenty of time. We have plenty of time.
Okay. So then we've got Deepa, who asks, with these double standards going everywhere nowadays, is there any chance to improve Black women's maternity journeys at all? Well, yes, Deepa. I just said Deepa, that's my daughter-in-law's name. Or Dekwa. Yes, simply because you're here. And if you're here, then it means that you want to do something, that you want to make a difference. So you will start to question your hospital trusts. You will start to question your MPs. You will start to hold people to account. So, Hannah, do we have some in the Q&A box that I haven't seen?
We have just a few. and you may have already covered these, obviously, you know, all very important questions, but different ways of saying them. So regarding biological weathering faced by Black and brown bodied women, what can the maternity system do to acknowledge and combat this during pregnancy, or is it too late by the time they present at hospital?
Well, it's part of the life arc, and it starts, you know, that pregnant bodied person who is carrying a baby within a body that's full of cortisol and the sympathetic nerve and everything is just off the charts, gives birth to a baby who lives in a world and a society that treats them the same. So is it too late when they present to you? Yes and no. Yes, because you can't prevent the biological weathering, but you can take responsibility for where you're a part of that. The other thing that you can do is recognize, these things are presenting not because their skin is black or brown, but because they have biological weathering. So now that I know it's not about their blackness and their brownness, I can treat them with equity and with care and with love. That's my answer to that one.
Lovely, thank you. And in your opinion, you've got so much experience in this, and you're so passionate about this, but what single change would you make to improve matters yourself? Listen.
Go Google Time Woman of the Year, Jenny Joseph, Jennie Joseph. Go Google the JJ way. Go Google common sense childbirth. And Jenny will tell you, listen, because that's why her rates of mortality and morbidity, maternal mortality and morbidity, is really low. So Keely asks, oh, hang on, no, Avni, before you ask me another one, because I saw the chat box go again. Is it really possible to improve the experiences within the system? I want to be an eternal optimist and say yes. I want to be the eternal pessimist and say, hell no. But I do think it's possible. And the reason I think it's possible is because people are here and people are hearing these things and people are trying to make a difference. The difference is made when we call out the excuses and we call in the people. Listen, there's nothing wrong with failing. There's nothing wrong with getting it wrong. If you put your hands up, an apology is as simple as I am sorry, not I'm sorry, but, and then let me tell you my life story and how it's affected me and how awful it makes me feel that you think that I have done this thing. Just say sorry and do something new and move on. Most of the, Avni continues to say that most of the Black and brown bodied women that they know have had good experience, that have had good experiences recently, have birthed outside the system. And when you birth outside the system finds a way to punish you. They find a way to punish you. So perhaps rather than saying, isn't it awful that people are birthing outside the system, what we need to do is find a way to take the system that wasn't designed for us and make it useful for all of us so that we call people in and we treat them well. You're welcome, Keely. In terms of next steps and future, do I have any key priorities and inspirational next steps? Yes, I challenge you, to all of you, to think about how do I cause Black and brown bodied people to thrive? Turn the lens away from the lens of victimhood and blaming that we turn on them. Let's turn towards them thriving. How do we get them to thrive? How do we begin to prevent the morbidities that are causing them not to thrive? And remember, to thrive is not the floor. The floor is the absolute base level. You do not thrive when you're at the absolute base level. You thrive when you're higher than that. Aisha recommends, oh gosh, yes, the book Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGrow. She has hour-long lectures on YouTube. I know I would love her, Aisha. I have the book and it's taking me months to read because it's so painful. Hannah, any other questions there?
That's enough from us, actually.
Okay.
So
Well,
wow.
let me just finish my wee slideshow. Because I just have one more thing to say. So what is it that you're going to do to close the gap? You don't make progress by standing on the sidelines, whimpering and complaining. You make progress by implementing ideas. You make progress by implementing ideas. What are your ideas? What are you going to implement? Start with yourself. Look at your bookshelf. How many Black and brown-bodied authors are on your bookshelf? How many gay and lesbian, Q+ non-binary authors do you have there? I'm not talking about your children's bookshelves. You're all brilliant at buying the books for your children and not reading and seeing the books for yourself. I had an Instagram argument that I rarely do with someone who told me that it was appalling, that I thought it was terrible that To Kill a Mockingbird was being used by white teachers to indulge in the joy of hearing Black-bodied children say the N-word, because we can't throw books like that away because they are great books. They are the classics. And my reply was, why are they the great books? Why are they the classics? Who said so? Oh, wait, a white man. So I challenge you to look at your bookcase. And now what's on your TV screen? What are you watching? What are the films? What are the programs? What are the lives? Are all the Black and brown bodied programs you watch issue programs? Are they all about the horrors of gang life and drugs, etc.? Do you watch anything that shows Black and brown bodied people just being ordinary and thriving? What does your friendship group look like? Don't go and find yourself a Black friend. We don't need white friends like that. We have all been the Black friend and we don't like it. But what does your circle look like? What does your family look like? What are you saying in your family dynamics? Yeah, well, it's my mum, my dad, my brother, my sister, my cousin, my grandma, my grandpa. They don't really mean it, but they say these things. Your silence is violence. You're colluding. You allow the societal narrative to continue. So what are you going to do? Who are you going to listen to? Who are you going to speak for, but not pushing them out of the way? Who are you going to amplify? Are you going to sit on the side and whimper and complain? Or are you going to implement some ideas? That's me done.
Wow, just thank you on behalf of everyone, Mars, for such an enlightening session today on such an important topic. I'm sure everyone here will agree with me that there is a lot to be taken away today, and we just thank you. And thank you for all those who have taken the time to attend today, and for those who are going to be watching the recording after. And for your fantastic questions today. What a great conversation. I'm so glad that everyone has really got involved and you know, asked these such pertinent questions to you today. We look forward to welcoming everyone again to our last session of our series, which is next week, when we're going to be hearing from Natasha Smith and Binesh Nazmeen on cultural safety and unconscious bias in maternity care. We'll be sending out the recording within the next day or two, and we'll give you the details of that thereafter. So thank you again, Mars, and thank you again for coming, and bye for now. Thank you.